Hey, thank you very much.
No problem.
So welcome everybody, and I'm so glad to be here because until I rejoined CETAR last year, wow, I'd been away for about over 25 years, and I'm just very happy to have a chance to be with people who have similar interests who can share their ideas and their responses to uh, the observations that I'm going to make today. Uh, so the topic that was suggested originally and which I proposed was the importance of history for understanding intercivilizational relations. But to be more specific, I actually want to treat the need to heal the trauma of imperialism in order to promote intercivilizational dialogue. So this is being a little more precise. And I think that for intercivilizational dialogue today, this is going to be the most important consideration. And therefore, we need to understand the history of imperialism and the responses to it and the traumas that were caused by it. Uh, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, how am I going to do this today? Well, uh, I'm going to read the presentation. It'll have accompaniment by slides, so that'll make it easier to follow the thread. And then there will be a PDF of the text, and the slides will also be made available afterwards. So I suggest focusing on the whole and seeing whether the image of the world that I'm presenting makes sense to you, rather than trying to focus on all the details, because there will just be so many, and you will have the text available. Okay, you can ask questions and ask for clarification through the chat, and I will pause at the end of each of the 6 sections to address them. At the halfway point, there'll be time for you to express your responses to the interpretation of history that I present. Does it make sense to you? And you do this by raising your hand. You have the reactions at the bottom. At the end, you'll have another chance to respond to the whole presentation. And I would appreciate, your presenting your views on the state of the world, and especially what do you think are the implications of the state of the world today for the intercultural social justice field. So why am I doing this presentation? What has motivated me? What has inspired me to do this? Well, I feel like the trauma of imperialism is not being addressed sufficiently. And I think this is one of the main factors that is putting intercivilizational dialogue out of reach. And the result is that we cannot address together the interrelated crises that we face. Uh, these are ecological, they are threats to world peace, there's widening inequality, there's what you might call the crisis of meaning, and many others that we really need to face as one humanity. And therefore, we need to move towards intercivilizational dialogue. So the title I'm actually going to use then is Towards Intercivilizational Dialogue, Healing the Trauma of Western Imperialism. Right, first section, Obstacles to Intercivilizational Dialogue. Now, the trauma of Western civilization has been a large but often unrecognized obstacle to intercivilizational dialogue. The impact of the past on the present tends to be downplayed. In particular, the trauma of the encounter with Western imperialism is often ignored. Yet the healing of such trauma is a key to improving relations between Western and other civilizations. I came to this realization while I was living in Japan in the 1980s. The emotional sensitivity and aesthetic sensibilities of the people I encountered in daily life impressed me, but I could not connect my experience with the ultranationalism of older generations and the brutality of Japanese soldiers in the Pacific War. Such confusion led me to study Japan's modern relations with the West, and I realized that this encounter opened wounds that had not been healed. Later, when I also investigated Chinese, Indian, and Islamic civilizations, I saw important similarities in the way the unhealed wounds of Western imperialism have been and are impeding effective communication between these civilizations and the West. The need for intercivilizational cooperation has never been greater due to ecological breakdown, widening equality, threat of nuclear war, all the things I've mentioned, the crisis of meaning. Yet, civilizations are moving further apart as nationalism and authoritarian forms of populism, emphasizing separation, gain greater allegiance. Exclusive identities are strongly emphasized as the narrative of progress with Western civilization as its vanguard is challenged by those who chafe at their continued subordination. In a time of mental decolonization, the common Western assumption that there is only one path to and through modernity and that modernization equals Westernization is being strongly challenged. Some of the most dangerous fault lines in our time have been at the interface of Eastern civilizations and the West. Now, I call these four civilizations Japanese, Chinese, Indian, and Islamic. Eastern in only this context, first of all, because this is how the West has labeled these civilizational others. But what they actually share, though, more than culture or geographical location, is the modern experience of subjugation and humiliation by the West. And this is going to be my focus. I want to make the point that the responses of pre-World War II Japan, Mao Zedong's China, radical Islam, and Hindu nationalism to Western imperialism have been similar. Rampant anti-Western sentiment, strident cultural assertion, and a decisive rejection of cultural blending and mixing. The four civilizations have also been engaged in overcoming fractured histories and healing traumas resulting from their forced entry into a Western-dominated world order. A necessary condition for a dialogue of civilizations that can address our interrelated crises is reckoning with this imperial and post-imperial past. So any questions in the chat up till now? Points for clarification?
Nothing here.
Nothing yet. Okay.
Okay, so
All right, let's go on to the next section, which is the imperial and post-imperial past. So I'm going to give a discussion of the four civilizations' response to the imperial era. Japan's fast track to modernization. In the initial phase of the Western intrusion, the overwhelming power of the West, largely stemming from its scientific and technological prowess, struck fear and awe into largely pre-modern peoples. But in the Japanese case, the period of imitating the West, called civilization and enlightenment, that began in the late 1860s, only lasted about 20 years before giving way to efforts to reclaim the traditional heritage. And by the early 1930s, Japanese elites sensed that they could challenge Western domination of Asia. By then, the weaknesses of Western civilization had become evident. Capitalism in disarray, liberal democracy in retreat, and an optimistic faith in progress assailed by doubts. But the devastation and suffering of the Pacific War taught many Japanese the lesson that becoming a world power required being inconspicuous and biding one's time while appearing to follow the West's lead. Head-on ideological challenges to the West had to be avoided. So Japan cooperated with the American government in the post-war era in containing Asian communism, gaining economic benefits at the cost of political subordination. Pre-war ultranationalism was transmuted into economic and cultural nationalism. By the mid-1980s, it was abundantly clear that Japanese capitalism was not a carbon copy of the US laissez-faire version. The US accused Japan of unfair trade and forced it to revalue its currency, reduce the volume of its exports, and build manufacturing facilities in the US. When the Japanese economy tanked at the end of the 1980s, the Japanese economic challenge to the West effectively ended. China's rupture with tradition. In contrast to Japan, China only began to undergo radical change as it was being carved up by the Western powers and Japan in the early 20th century. The inability of the government to unify the country and drive out the foreign powers led to a rejection of tradition, which was blamed for China's pathetic condition. Young people looked to the Western left for both diagnosis and solutions. When Mao Zedong unified China in 1949, the dependency relationship with the West finally ended, and an alternative Chinese modernity began to clearly emerge, based on a Chinese version of Marxism. China walked in Japan's footsteps once the reform movement gathered momentum in the late 1970s. By this, I mean the Chinese government's strategy then was to keep a low profile, take an unassertive foreign policy, and follow the US lead on international matters. However, by the 20th century, accelerated economic growth had stimulated nationalism and a desire for China to assume its accustomed place at the center of East Asia. Now, Xi Jinping, the supreme leader, would like to drive the West out of East Asia and establish China's own sphere of influence, reminiscent of pre-war Japan. India's emergence from a long, dark colonial winter. In India, the British Empire took control at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and did not relinquish it until India's independence in 1947. Whereas in 1600, it was the world's leading manufacturer and had a 22.5% share of world GDP, after rule first by the British East India Company and then the British government, India's share fell by 1900 to about 2%. For consolation, some educated Indians exalted their spiritual heritage, conceding Western superiority in the material domain. The feeling among many Indians was that life in Europe was more civilized and preferable to what India could offer. It was only in the late 20th century that Hindu nationalism, in tandem with rapid economic development, began to reverse this widespread attitude. The need to revive Indian spiritual fiber in the face of British devaluation of their religion and culture led to the modernization of Hinduism, lessening the grip of many disabling superstitions and unjust practices. Since the 1990s, politicized Hinduism has gained much popular support, defining what it means to be Indian in an exclusive and discriminatory manner, while rejecting long-standing Indian aspirations to tolerance of the diverse religious groups, linguistic communities, and ethnicities. The democratic institutions that India had adopted from British political thought are now under siege. Islam's struggles to regain its equilibrium. The Islamic world was thoroughly colonized by the West, causing severe trauma. Having been Europe's other for close to 1,000 years, it was subject to a highly virulent form of racial prejudice, coupled with contempt for its religion and culture. Forced to become dependent on the West, Muslim societies weren't able to regain their equilibrium. And until the 1970s, there was a strong tendency to adopt Western ways while downgrading the Islamic heritage. As in India, the Islamic world has an elite that is often Western in outlook, in contrast to the vast majority of the population that upholds older Muslim notions of piety and ethical action. Religious revival has been the central vehicle for achieving Muslim dreams from the 1970s until the present. But the politics of the Islamic revival have ranged from socialist to liberal to authoritarian. There is general agreement that Western secularism, the banishing of moral considerations from political economy, unrestrained consumerism, an addiction to social media and entertainment are not the answer, but there's less agreement over whether Western ideals of democracy, intellectual and religious freedom, and human rights have universal validity, particularly in light of Western people's reluctance to follow their own principles. Okay, is there any questions or points to clarify? Nothing yet?
Nothing in the chat, so we're good.
Okay.
It's on export.
All right, then we'll move on to the next section, which is encounters with Western imperialism. Western people can help narrow the divides that make world peace such a distant dream by learning about what the Western intrusion was like from the writings of each civilization's most sensitive observers. This would be an excellent way to nurture empathy and compassion. Japan, on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The great early 20th century novelist Natsume Soseki deeply experienced the psychological and emotional trauma caused by Japan's sudden and forced entry into the modern world. He observed that the speed with which Japan was changing produced a condition approaching a nervous breakdown. Japanese attempts to become a wealthy and powerful nation for self-defense were resulting in a mechanical imitation of the West while cutting off cultural roots. Frantic adoption of a foreign civilization brought great uncertainty and anxiety, self-division, and loss of integrity. In his own life, Soseki's feelings about General Maresuke Nogi's suicide on the day of the Emperor Meiji's funeral in 1912 reflected his identity confusion. General Nogi, beloved hero of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5, in an act of loyalty to the emperor, his lord, followed what he believed to be the way of the samurai by committing ritual suicide together with his wife. This act profoundly moved Soseki, showing he was still attached to what he called feudal values, even though he had adopted his own version of modern individualism as a philosophy of life. China, dismembered, prostrate, fragmented, pathetic. The stories and essays of Lu Xun, China's greatest modern writer, show what it was like for a highly critical, realistic, and perceptive intellectual to experience the era of foreign domination and Chinese weakness. Lu Xun was the conscience of the May 4th movement of 1919, who often despaired that Chinese people could awaken and develop their wills while lamenting the terrible poverty, starvation, and the selling of children that prevailed. He wrote, "Our vaunted Chinese civilization is only a feast of human flesh prepared for the rich and mighty, and China is only the kitchen where these feasts are prepared." Lu Xun also observed in 1923, "Unless a great whip lashes her on the back, China will never be willing to move forward of her own accord." The whip was foreign imperialism, which caused such pain that industrial workers, the commercial class, students, and intellectuals were stirred to take political action. Both the Chinese nationalist and communist parties gained large followings as they drew the connections between foreign domination and China's terrible economic situation. India, exiled at home, divided self, loss of integrity. Modern Indians, according to Ashish Nandi, a political psychologist and a highly influential public intellectual, have deeply imbibed a Western view of their place in world history, as well as 19th century ideas of the nation state. In The Intimate Enemy, Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism, 1983, he points out that notions of nationalism, progress, rationality, secularism, and even of a desirable society have taken on a Western aura as modern Indians have lost their cultural memories, becoming strangers to vital aspects of their own past. Sunk in a colonial mentality, the Indian psyche is a house divided against itself. Nandi points out that India was once more receptive to plural realities. Although modernity has brought Indians greater individual freedom, it has also increased their need for stability, cultural continuity, and psychological security. Hindu nationalist demagogues meet this need through ethnic, chauvinist, nationalist, and populist appeals that offer a sense of community based on Hindu cultural identity. Nandi scorns the idea that liberalism fully supersedes traditional outlooks. On the other hand, he urges that traditional approaches to society and politics should not be given a free pass just because they are authentic. Islam, religion undermined, ethics banished from the public sphere. Muhammad Iqbal is India's greatest modern poet and thinker, and his interrogation of Western political thought suggests Gandhi, his contemporary. The difference between European and Indian conditions led Iqbal to assert that the Western version of liberal democracy was unsuitable for India. The type of liberal democracy that Indian nationalists advocated favored the educated urban classes embedded in the commercial economy. The peasants, making up the majority population, were not receptive to liberal notions such as interests, representation, and contract. The West was spreading liberal ideas which Iqbal, like Gandhi, saw as undermining religion in India. Liberalism divided life into public and private arenas, consigning religion and whatever else did not relate to material things and property to the private realm. As a result, religion no longer affects social and political life and does not restrain the baser human tendencies. Religious faith is not easily represented in terms of interest and contract because it is nurtured by dialogue and conversation, and it is through conversation that ethics is given life. The liberal ideology imposed by the West forces Muslims to abandon their ideal of spiritualized politics, turning their world upside down. Okay, I'd like to pause here and
There's
I hope you will raise your hands
and then there's two questions.
so I can answer your questions. And we already have questions here. So how do these larger macro relations between civilizations manifest themselves into micro communication situations? Wow, that's a great question. Uh, Let me just take one civilization, the one that I know best, which is Japan, where I lived for many years. And there, okay, what I found when I first came to Japan in 1973, I discovered, to my surprise, that Japanese people had what was called a gaijin complex, a foreigner complex. So a lot of Japanese, when they talk to Western people, now the foreigner here means Western, especially white, and maybe male to some degree as well. Um, Whenever they talk to us, not not always, but very often there was a feeling like a panic, and some of us would joke, "Oh, what's the score on the panic meter?" Now, what this is an extreme, but what it showed was that the defeat in the war had led to a loss of self-confidence, and as I said, a very low profile, and uh, a feeling that the Western gaze was something that they had to be very careful about because they didn't want to provoke this stronger group of people, into reacting in hostile ways. So there was a lot of talk about internationalizing as a way of pleasing Western people. So that's the best example that I can give. Um,
The second one is here.
by phrasing one of the solutions as the West can help feels like a continued form of imperialism. Um, have I said that the West can help? Actually, when I talk about trauma in the second half, I will talk about what the West can actually do. So let's address that in the second half. Um, Riffing off of what Vanessa has said above, the West and Western, naming the colonizer countries specifically and their colonization of which specific country would focus attention to the source of their trauma. Some of the colonized countries are specified here, but not the colonizers. Yeah, of course, that's an important point. So, um, okay, to clarify this, let me say that the patterns I'm talking about, to some extent, you can actually find them within the West itself. So if you look at, say, late 18th century Germany, you already have these same kinds of patterns where it wasn't colonization, but it's like a feeling that there is a cultural domination by France, the stronger and central European civilization. So what happened was then that German people began emphasizing their own specific culture. You had people like Herder, developing all these notions of, we are Germans, we are not just, Europeans, we are not just, inferior Frenchmen. We have our own culture, and they started going back to studying their own folklore. And I think that's the pattern that started in the West, and then it shifted kind of chronologically from Japan, first of all, to then China, and then you have, India and Islam, where you have these strong nationalistic reactions. And um, of course, it's not only to the West, it's more specifically like, let's say, in the Japanese post-war instance, it's more specifically toward America, which was dominating them culturally and which was the hegemonic power. Okay. So, what the reason why I brought everything together as East and West, or is because I felt like the the clash of civilizations, to the extent that it exists, and we want to heal ourselves from the causes of that clash, it exists between the West and especially these four, what I'm calling Eastern civilizations. But of course, it exists between the West and Africa, for example. You know. And specifically, if we're talking about Africa, then we need to emphasize, um, Great Britain and France and Portugal. Okay, yeah. So I think that's a point that's very well taken. What else has come up here?
Well, that's it for the.
Okay, what has anybody raised their hand?
No.
No.
Yeah. Good.
Okay, what time is it?
Time is it? Just continue.
Okay, all right, let me continue then. Trauma and intercivilizational relations. Is it valid to describe the encounter with Western imperialism as traumatic? And if so, how does this understanding contribute to more just and harmonious intercivilizational relations? According to Gabor Mate, trauma is a raw wound or scar, and our response to trauma shapes our behavior and social habits and how we think about the world. Tragically, blind reactions to trauma prevent us from thinking rationally about the most important things in our lives. Does this definition of trauma apply to the experiences of large groups of people as well as individuals? Thomas Herbel tells us that collective traumas are the cause of most conflicts, although they are usually not recognized as such. Here, he's referring to ethical transgressions brought about by war and other types of oppression. Herbel also points out that the colonial encounter caused severe trauma that has often been ignored. For this reason, healing and peace building are difficult to achieve. Herbel calls the process of becoming aware of histories and trauma and gaining insight into them global social witnessing, describing it as, I quote, the ability to feel and relate to the cultural process. Such inner awareness enables people to map social relations and see the connection between their own experience and that of their society. It is only through such awareness that the vicious circle of reactivity can be ended. The fractured histories of those peoples who encountered Western imperialism must be retrieved in order to complete the cycle of trauma and recovery. Eastern peoples no longer remember the original events, and the fragments of memory have become unconscious, triggered whenever events in the present remind them of the original experience. When the victims of oppression are able to reflect and self-critically examine their motives and actions, they can make conscious choices and change habitual patterns of behavior. For instance, they can offer forgiveness rather than seek vengeance. Creative responses to histories of oppression are a necessary condition for civilizational renewal. From the Western side, one major challenge has been that of how to deal with terrorism. The most common response has been to seek vengeance, which leads to inflicting fresh traumas. But reflective and aware people can respond from a different level than the perpetrators. They can consciously decide not to seek retribution, thereby breaking the relational pattern that feeds the conflict. By engaging in social witnessing rather than reacting to provocation, it's possible to act sensitively and with compassion, setting a new relational dynamic in motion. Western people have been perpetrators of trauma, but have also been affected by trauma. There is a profound denial of the imperialist past among many North Americans and Europeans today, and an inability to acknowledge their race and class-based privilege. The pattern of denial, repression, and dissociation that can be observed at the collective level discloses the familiar symptoms of trauma. Such trauma, though, is largely the product of their own societies. As Gabor Mate notes, amid spectacular economic, technological, and medical resources, our current culture induces countless humans to suffer illness born of stress, ignorance, inequality, environmental degradation, climate change, poverty, and social isolation. It is imperative that both sides no longer interpret history in ways that lead to a perception of themselves as good and highly competent citizens who always act in ways that are beyond reproach. Instead, Western people need to apologize for the damage they inflicted on weaker peoples, and through appropriate action, demonstrate the sincerity of their efforts to achieve reconciliation. Adopting a victim mentality prevents recognition of one's own shortcomings and forecloses the possibility of taking responsibility for one's own historical fate. By addressing trauma, it is possible to start bringing about the ideological and institutional changes that can take us beyond the nation-state system. It would then no longer be necessary to gain maximum wealth and power in order to keep competing nations at bay in a zero-sum international order where the strong oppress the weak. The conditions that produce collective trauma would begin to disappear. Of course, this is a highly utopian vision, but I wonder if we have a choice any longer. Anyway, next section, towards intercivilizational dialogue. The peoples of the four Eastern civilizations are aware that their national purpose can no longer merely be to catch up with the West economically and militarily. The rise of first Japan and now China in particular shows that we are entering a new world of plural civilizations. Continuing pressure to assimilate to the present world order under US hegemony produces resistance to its values and institutions. Alternative modernities are being created. The concept of multiple modernities now seems far more persuasive than modernization theory, which assumed there was basically one path and all civilizations follow. Under Chinese leadership, the BRICS nations are demanding a new world order that satisfies their needs and gives them a significant voice in determining the institutions and rules for a globalizing world. And this group is now in the process of expanding its membership among the nations of the global South. However, there is an important exception to this trend, Japan. Although it encountered Western imperialism, it is now in the Western camp, militarily and politically, the result of geopolitical considerations and China's inept diplomacy. The likelihood of a nuclear war is greatest between China and the US, with Taiwan's status being the most likely flashpoint. China is motivated by desires to avenge the century of humiliation, to reunite the country, neutralize cultural and political diversity, and keep out Western influence. By dredging up past grievances through the education system and the media, virulent nationalism is stimulated. Rather than face the traumatic past, Chinese leaders use it as a way to increase their popularity, offering people the dream of taking the place of the US as the world's hegemonic power. In contrast, the US and other Western nations want China to be more like them, since they see Western values, liberal democracy, and capitalism as enlightened and progressive. Blind to the role of trauma, Western people, especially Americans, blame any resistance to the Enlightenment outlook on backward and regressive ways of thinking. In other words, Western people are still the teachers, and the rest must play the part of students. This scenario was played out with Japan in the early post-war era and China during the Reform era. Once Japan and China became strong enough, they asserted themselves culturally and took pride in their identity, no longer pretending to be good students. But their own efforts to free themselves from the past were unsuccessful. Since they did not acknowledge and work through the traumatic experiences stemming from imperial times, they were still trapped in the logic of power. Western societies are the source of traumas that their own people have been unable to acknowledge and deal with. As a result, their citizens are vulnerable to political figures who direct their attention to others as the source of their problems. The policies they support perpetrate further trauma on perceived enemies as the cycle continues. Western nationalists who want to bring back the glory days of alleged greatness are locked in a hostile embrace with aggrieved Eastern nationalists. Post-traumatic learning enables all of us to avoid the tragic fate where the wounds of the past, not integrated, continue to live in us today, driving us to engage in endless wars. Such learning requires taking history into account, in particular, the history of Western imperialism and its aftermath. It also involves compassionate inquiry into our traumas. Okay, now I want to offer a chart here of the different standpoints I've been talking about. And there's something very important that I want to emphasize. Now, here, in this particular context, when I'm talking about East and West, West refers to the people who have experienced the modern traumas, let's call them, and are not aware that they have and have done very little to heal them. You see, whereas Eastern people here that I'm referring to are those who experienced the trauma of imperialism and then have been largely unaware of these wounds, and therefore they have been unable to heal the traumas. So what this is the hostile embrace of East and West that I'm talking about. It's not referring to all Western people. It's not referring to all Eastern people. So these are their different standpoints, because what I'm saying is that due to the historical circumstances, they've been positioned differently. And that is why we have these different standpoints. Culture for the West, ornamental and commodified. The Western people who are not unaware of the traumas. And for the East, culture is an unchanging essence. Identity, in the West, you have the civil religion of liberalism, and you can add here conservatism as well. And in the East, religion, ethnicity, ethno-nationalism. Time, it's all future orientation. You know, the things are going to always get better under Western leadership. The East, it's both an orientation to the future and the past. Politics, West, liberal, conservative. East, fascist, communist. Now, again, what I'm emphasizing here is the extreme reactions of countries which whose leaders were not aware of these traumas and basically did nothing to heal them and led people along these paths. And I'm saying the same thing has happened in the United States and in Europe. So liberal conservative, in one sense, is not so different from fascist communist, in one sense. Okay, history. For the West, modernization is westernization. For the East, alternative or multiple modernities. Adaptation, cultural adaptation, assimilate the others. They must assimilate. Um, in the East, separation from the West. Okay. Yeah. Um, all right, now let's, unless there are any questions in the chat, move on to the last
No,
part. Okay. Eastern contributions to healing trauma. The trauma of imperialism and the trauma caused by modern life that reinforces the pathologies that led to imperial conquest in the first place need to be addressed on a worldwide scale. As Herbal notes, there must be an integration of the findings of the psychological, neurological, epigenetic, and sociocultural fields with the mystical paths to healing and being human. Science and spirit come together as present-day insights and ancient wisdom enhance each other. The great scholar of Islam, Syed Hossein Nasir, points out that the Enlightenment does not offer the teachings and practices that enable humans to uncover their wholeness. This requires intellectual intuition and contemplation, universal ways of gaining knowledge that are found at the core of all the world religions. Nasir also demonstrates how world religions, when properly interpreted, provide an indispensable foundation for an ecological ethic. Let's take a brief look at the spiritual core of the world's religions in the four Eastern civilizations and see what they might contribute to healing trauma. The esoteric and mystical teachings of the major religions in Eastern civilizations, they share a philosophy of non-dualism. This is needed to counteract the modern tendency toward fragmentation, in which mind and body, self and other, humans and nature, the individual and the cosmos are conceived and experienced as existing in isolation from each other. I'll now give an example from each civilization. Japan, Zen Buddhism. Japanese intellectuals like the Kyoto philosopher Masao Abe have located the strength of Zen Buddhism in its ability to have no attachment to thinking. This enables the self to experience itself from the inside and to recognize that reason can never know things as they truly are. Therefore, Zen enables one to act from no mind, which then gives life to one's thoughts. Only action from this space of no mind is truly free. The main weakness of Zen is that its approach of non-thinking often ends up as merely not thinking, that is, failure to think. Then Zen falls short of inspiring positive and creative thinking that can address the major ethical and social issues of our time, even though it is capable of doing so. Zen can contribute to freeing the individual from trauma and also has the potential to heal collective trauma. The Confucian scholar Due Ming, in his critique of the Enlightenment mentality, has called for a move beyond the politics of domination, the exploitation of nature, and the pursuit of private interests, to a revitalized Confucian ethics. Confucian ideals of self-cultivation, the dignity of the person, family cohesiveness, and social solidarity can enable East Asians to realize their full humanity. The West, the West has developed the individual while ignoring the role of relationships in human development. It has emphasized personal realization, but not moral self-knowledge. It has promoted individual freedom without fostering the sense of duty and responsibility. Confucian disciplines of self-cultivation and ways of connecting the self to the local area, the community, the natural environment, and the cosmos provide a foundation for building social institutions that no longer reinforce collective trauma. In India, British colonialism had a positive effect of stimulating Hindus to reform their religious practices and institutions by emphasizing the rational aspects, eliminating some of the superstitious beliefs, and letting go of the more ethically dubious practices. Although this religious orientation did not spread beyond the upper classes, it was the foundation for Rabindranath Tagore's advocacy of Asian spirituality as a challenge to Western materialism. I already mentioned this in the earlier part. Now, these days, the spread of India's spiritual philosophies, such as Vedanta, and practices like yoga and meditation to the West is an indicator of their great potential for the healing of individual trauma. Islam can serve as an inspiration for addressing the trauma of gender discrimination. Sadiya Sheikh, the South African Muslim scholar, praises the medieval mystic and philosopher Ibn Arabi for expressing some of the most vibrant notions of gender within Islamic thought. I quote, balancing more sovereign theological images of divine power that bid existence into being. Ibn Arabi also describes God's primordial creativity through feminine images of pregnancy, labor, and birthing, foregrounding a relationship of fullness, identity, connection, and interiority vis-a-vis God. She adds that Ibn Arabi brings together divine qualities such as mercy and beauty with the great majesty of the divine, clearly and forcefully arguing that men and women have equal spiritual abilities and both share in the archetype of the complete human. Now, I also want to mention that there are spiritual traditions with animistic outlooks that can help bridge humans and nature. In Japan, we have the Shinto teachings and practices, which are being already examined as a source of native ecological wisdom. And in China and India, the opposition to the government development plans that damage the environment comes mostly from the local peoples attempting to preserve their ways of life that are based on religious outlooks that emphasize the interconnection with nature. Conclusion. We are entering an era in which Western dominance and US hegemony may not endure. Rather than overtaking the West in order to gain primacy, Eastern peoples have an opportunity for civilizational renewal by reviving their spiritual traditions. Zen Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, the yogic tradition, and Sufism, for example, can help heal the trauma of imperialism and the social pathologies that have stood in the way of intercivilizational dialogue. Okay, so now is the time to ask questions, and let's have clarification of issues if they are in the shadows.
The files, right? Well, we'll test the files.
Okay, you will get the slides of the presentation and you will get the text, and the text will also have quite a few pages of bibliographical essays. So you'll get all the references, not all, but the
Yeah.
major ones. Yeah.
We'll upload it right now, so
Okay.
it'll be on the chat. So
Okay. Yeah, this is my daughter Lena, who has been doing the slides, and she will upload it now. Okay.
Okay, and then the other file will be added
Okay.
to
Yeah.
this one, right?
Okay.
It should be these two.
Okay.
So
I would really like to hear your observations, and how you respond to the picture that I've presented. I'm really interested in hearing your pictures of the world today, and what are the implications for the field of intercultural communication and social justice, you know, uh, given the kind of world that we are presently living in, and the way things are going.
It's 9:30.
So we still have 15 minutes.
Yeah, they're still processing.
Okay. A lot to take in. Yes, I agree with that. Just whatever comes to your mind, and let's take it from there. Now is the time to be interactive. I'd love to hear your voices.
Yeah. Oh, Sandy.
Okay, Bill,
Oh,
it's
thank
Sandy
you.
Fowler.
Hi.
Hi. I remember you from, I believe you spoke at one of our conferences, CTAR conferences. Peggy Push was the person who introduced you to me. Um, I'm sitting here thinking about our two prospective nominees for president in the United States and thinking about Trump trying to even just listen to this. I can't imagine that he would. And if he tried to listen, he wouldn't get a bit of it, not a bit. Uh, Biden, there's a better chance that he could sit through it and actually take some of it in. And that's, of course, scary to me because there's a possibility that Trump will actually win the election. Um, I keep thinking, what can interculturalists do in a circumstance like this? And I really appreciate what you had to say. Um, how do we get that across to people who are going to be shaping our futures?
Well, you see, I'm asking people like you. That's why I wanted to present it at CIATAR because, intercultural communication is a practice-driven field. So I'm more of a theorist. So I'm asking you, if this is the big picture, well, what do we do? Because that's what I'd like to know too, right?
I don't have an answer.
Oh, well, let's together come up with one.
Two thoughts
Yeah.
came, well, three actually. One was the interesting thought that Western societies traumatize themselves. I mean, that makes sense. I'd never heard it that way. And that says something to me. And then the other thing I was thinking about between the conflict between Israel and Palestine and how that is also impacted by Western civilization somewhat when we say Western European and US. And then the other thing was Japan in World War II, the impact that it had on China and South Korea and the trauma of that
Oh, yes.
in the so I don't know if you want to address any of that, but
Okay, so the first one again was,
was Western societies, the trauma within their
okay,
societies
yeah.
versus Western and Eastern.
Okay.
Yeah.
It just very recently, Gabor Mate came out with the book called The Myth of Normal. And he
Okay.
goes into all of these different traumas that we have been experiencing. And it's very persuasive. He's an expert on trauma. And this relates to your point about Israel and Palestine and the relation to the West, because he has given talks in which he addresses these instances of collective trauma, and he explicitly talks about it in those terms that Jews went through the trauma of the Holocaust, and Palestinians went through the trauma of the Nakba, 1948. Okay, and this is what they're going through right now. So the analysis, in his view, fits perfectly. But here's what I think the connection is between the West and the situation in the Middle East. There is that, in a way, Israel is under Western hegemony, a U.S. hegemony, I mean, okay, and is being supported by the U.S. And in a way, Israel, I mean, this might sound harsh, but is the U.S.'s proxy in the Middle East, And then on the other side, of course, you have all of these groups like the Iranians who haven't dealt with the trauma adequately and are just reacting. So you have all these reactive groups. Hamas has not dealt with the terrible traumas of the Nakba, and that was why it was originally formed as a social welfare group. And instead, it has failed to address the traumas adequately. So I think that Israel and Palestine is an example where you have East and West in the way that I'm using them, are confronting each other. Israel is part of the West, and Hamas is part of the East. Yeah. And what was the last point?
The next one was Japan's impact, or World War II.
Okay. Okay, so you have different levels of trauma, right? All right. Now, at the top level, you have the West inflicting trauma on Japan, China, India, and Islam, right? And then at the next level, lower, you have what you talked about, terrible traumas that Japan inflicted on other Asian peoples, and the post-war terrible prejudice against, say, for example, Koreans and Chinese, And then in China, you have the oppression on the part of the government and the Chinese and the Han Chinese of Tibetans, the Xinjiang people, and then wanting to take over Taiwan. Okay. And then in India, it's the oppression, the Hindu nationalists are oppressing Muslims. They're intimate enemies. I mean, they're the same Indian people, right? They're oppressing them, And then in Islam, I mean, you have a lot of intolerance, toward minority religions now. So that's the second level of trauma. Yeah, I mean, I would even call this perhaps the transfer of oppression downward.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, your initial question, how do we take this information that you gave us, and how is that applied, or how can that be? And for me, it's like just increasing my knowledge and the level of sensitivity, and also the importance of reckoning with trauma, because some of the people working with, they come with trauma, and I'm very aware of that, and how to, in my work, how to manage that. And that's just a statement. Yeah, and Hannah too, I just saw in the chat. It's like, because for example, in Atlantis, has a lot of refugees. So I'm kind of thinking, okay, there's the trauma of that situation, and then we're working with. And
What
I don't know.
Well, okay, well, yeah, I mean, right along the lines that you're talking about, read Thomas, Herbal's Healing Collective Trauma.
Okay.
And he's got a new book out called Attunement, but start with the Healing Collective Trauma. And there he makes a lot of recommendations for our societies addressing these issues. They're so raw, and they're hurting us as societies in so many ways. So in a way, I mean, you could say it's an opening for organizations like CITAR and many others that are capable of dealing with trauma, that are aware of this and can, address the intercultural dimensions and the social justice dimensions. It's an opening if the society is willing to support these things and to encourage them. So it's like something to try to promote. I would read Herbal to to get some insight, because I'm not an expert by any means on these areas, you know. Yeah.
Right. I think we're,
Okay, is there anyone else?
yeah, any more questions? We can kind of make it to gallery view so we can see everyone.
Yeah.
Hello, I don't see an option to raise hand, so if I just
Thank you. No worries.
can
Okay,
share,
yeah,
can
yeah,
share.
please. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. And to be honest, I don't have much experience with the history of those parts of the world. So I'm more in the like present intercultural field and relationships. And to me, it was yeah, a very general, very generalized, so like a very broad picture, because we speak about civilizations, you know, and in the historical perspective. So in my field, I try to not generalize as much. And to be honest, like I even have a slide on my slideshow when I work with participants, saying like warning them that we are going to make generalizations when we speak about like Germany, about the United States, about Mexico, and so on. So I try to focus the attention on personal interactions, and like yes, there are generalizations that we make, but in the end we are communicating with the person in front of us. So just to share my perspective, what we as interculturalists can do, working like knowing this information like in the background, and it may be very useful to know that historical perspective. But what I do when I do intercultural programs, I always tell people like, I train you about the US way of doing things, not to make US Americans out of you, but to so that you are aware of those differences, but you can bring the most value out of your experience, out of your culture, out of your background. So I try to focus on that and show like focus on equality, you know, like you were invited to work here in the United States to bring that new perspective, that value of your culture. And something else we can do as interculturalists is to push for trainings here, like for people who are here in the United States. And that came up many times, and during this conference too, that we often focus on people who come like expatriates, but we do not work with the teams that they come into to work with. So it also creates like that inequality, I would say, that we give that knowledge and we work with people who come from abroad, but we don't really work with local people who are like receiving society. So I think
Okay, no,
that
I agree with everything you said. Yeah, I'm just trying to provide some background information that you may find useful. And you know, I want to emphasize the relationship between the intercultural communication and social justice fields on the one hand, and the historical situation that we're in, you know, which to me are perilous times filled with crises. So I'm wondering, you know, if the situation that we're in now mandates or dictates or suggests any shifts in our own perspectives as interculturalists and social justice advocates. I mean, I'm just offering that as a question. I'm not at all suggesting an answer, because I have to confess, I've been away from CETAR for 25 years. I only came back last year. And I've been retired for 10 years, so I haven't been teaching intercultural communication for 10 years. So I'm rather removed from the world of practice right now. So I'm not making any suggestions about practice. I'm just offering this, you know, as maybe it will be useful for some people to understand why we're in this kind of a world we're in now, why things look so, at least to me, so dark. Of course, the shadows always then will eventually bring out the light. but I think we're in the shadows right now. No, no, I know they will, but it's been very tough. It's a very tough time. Yeah.
That's a good point.
But thank you anyways for those
Yeah,
insights.
well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess we're at the end now then. Yeah, and I thank everybody for attending and for participating. Yeah, and trauma is the hostile embrace. Yeah, so let's deal with it. Okay, bye then.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. I'm going to be closing the room here in just a second. So if you want to just start making your way to your next presentations, I just don't want to kick anyone out when I close the room. Okay. And Bill, that was an amazing presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sandy, I recognize you from many years ago. I never met
Yes.
you, but I heard of you many times, so I was very happy that you were still involved. And I'm glad that you